motives, the parties, and stakeholders, and the dimensions, and try to understand the different strategies for the future. It is a great pleasure to welcome our guests in this second session, focusing on the different parties. From Nouakchott, we have Muhammad Salim Wald Omar. Welcome. And from Algeria, Dr. Nasib Minhol, Professor of Political Science in Al Bulaida University. From Rabat, Mr. Mustafa Jali, Moroccan researcher in geopolitical relations and international relations. And from Doha, Mr. Muhammad Omar, he is a military and security expert. You are all welcome. We start with France and the colonial heritage with Mr. Muhammad Salim Wold Omar, talking about France and the colonial policies. So, what is the policy for this heritage, the French colonial heritage in Africa? For 5 minutes, please. In the name of God, the most gracious, most merciful, I would like to thank Al Jazeera Centre for Studies, and I would like to thank Al Jazeera Network, Al Jazeera Mubasher, and I would like to thank our esteemed colleagues. In my opinion, the colonial heritage and influence of France was based on several dimensions in space and time. France occupied large parts of Africa for more than 3 decades, and this allowed France to uh, have influence and also create public opinion that is supportive of the French policies. So these decades of colonialism and occupation were enough for France to become highly influential in Africa. This is when it comes to the space and time influence of France. And France had enough time to make Africa the way it wanted and use its resources, reform or reshape its identities, and then France put together the post independence scene. The independence became a necessity at one point, and the popular movements in the 50s. So the revolutionary movement became strong in Africa, and France therefore started post-colonial policy, and they tried to enable the rulers to rule on behalf of them in Africa. Most of the governments and the regimes that ruled in Africa after colonialism only represented another phase of French occupation, and some regimes served France more than the colonialism itself, and dealt in a very harsh way with people's efforts for liberation and endeavors to be liberated. And after France controlled the rulers of Africa and came up with regimes to manage its interests, France worked on military coup, more than 200 coups in Africa, and France was highly influential when it comes to these coup in order to protect the influence of France and in order to prevent the collapse of a certain state, because this collapse would result in the collapse of the many interests of France and Africa. So France was highly present. For instance, in Mauritania, we see that France was there to form the independence elite and passed the ruling power and authorities to them. And there was also a coup in 1987, and the coup uh, ousted the president that was opposed or had become opposed to the the French influence. So the support of France allowed this coup to happen faster, and also François Mitterrand uh, oversaw the another coup, and President Mohamed Faure was subject to pressure by François Mitterrand, and France was also present throughout the coup by the patronage and management and overseeing. And the latest coup in Mali led to also a Russian influence. After this, we can talk about fake democracies and vulnerable democracies, and after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the spread of democracy and people's will to achieve democracy, France also worked in a preemptive measure. There was a conference under the patronage of François Mitterrand, and this conference resulted in some sort of democracy. The role of the citizen starts through elections and ends through elections, and we saw some governments serving the interests of France the way the former rulers did. Mr. Muhammad Salim Wald Omar, please stay with me. So we will continue with you later on during the second round of questions. I would like to remind you that please, we have 5 minutes for each guest. So I would like to talk about the United States and the security issue in Africa with Professor Nassim. So, what is the influence of these military exercises on the strategic influence in Northern Africa? I would like to thank Al Jazeera Studies Center for Studies for this important conference focusing on Africa and an important period because regional studies that take into account the relations between major powers and the rise of emerging powers and the role of all these powers in Africa. This led to a matrix that is very critical. So the African Lion exercises 2021 is the continuation of a series of exercises with the participation of 25 or 16 countries, from observers to countries that partook in these exercises. What is important is that we cannot lead or read the background of the exercises without talking about the strategic balance in North Africa. When it comes to the United States wants or has a specific vision, security vision in the region that cannot be separated from the Zionist vision. The United States of America is the Zionist presence in the region, and this geographic location was used for a long period of time, and it did not pose any threat to the Zionist entity. So, the series of exercises and their influence on strategic balance in North Africa. So, the exercises could be repeated in several critical areas in this region that witness rising competition to the United States in this arena that is very important. The only thing that is important for the United States when it comes to the African continent is the shift from the exploitation and crisis management approach that serves the hegemony of the United States. Now, there is a very specific vision that is witnessing a shift from this exploitation of crises domestically. So, a shift to the continent and the outer areas or regions. If we take into account the geopolitical map, we notice that the United States, through this chaos of military exercises that are taking place repeatedly in the continent, and when I talk about military exercises, there is a distinction between what is announced and what is secret. We have military exercises where soldiers wear their fatigues and carry out the war games, and there are also the secret maneuvers where the civilians or the soldiers wear civilian clothes. So these exercises are at the heart of the U.S. Strategy in order to measure its military readiness, and the United States wants to work on its readiness using African resources and using African countries such as Tunisia and other countries raise questions because there are series of strategic exercises, but the timing is critical to a certain extent because these exercises come with a difference of 2 weeks. Uh, there's 2 weeks separating this exercise from the war games of Algeria and the engagement of Israel with Centcom. And if North Africa still forms a headache to Israel, is it possible that these military exercises, the African Lion 2021, so the question is, will we understand the new role that is played in this region And yes, doctor. Yes, doctor. So the agenda of Centcom in Africa. So there's a shift maybe towards leadership at the military level in Africa. Yes, doctor, doctor, 7 minutes. Doctor, sorry to. So this allows Israel to oversee these parts of Africa, and we will go back, Doctor. Please let us stick to 5 minutes in order to be able to finish all the discussing all the topics. So Dr. Mustafa Al Jali, the researcher in international relations and geopolitical issues. So another angle. Let us talk about China and Africa. The strategic reserve f- for China. So, what are the main elements of this dimension? I would like to thank Al Jazeera Centre for Studies, and I would like to thank you and greetings to the esteemed guests. Uh, I would like to start by describing the economic strategy in Africa that could be highlight or summarized in several points. Natural resources, also foreign currencies for China through investments abroad, multinationals, and finding new markets, and developing the agricultural sector in Africa in order for the produce to be exported back to China. So for China, this is a priority among other priorities, and China is one of the main importers of raw material, and 80% of the raw material comes from Africa. And China, through these imports, tries to fulfill its needs in order to fulfill the needs of the domestic market, and at the same time guarantee the heavy industrial sector, and also help in the rise of geopolitical and geoeconomic role of China. If we talk about the consumption rates of oil and energy, China is number two worldwide after the United States, and the share is projected to rise in 2030. So the imports of oil from Africa are up to 30% in countries like Angola and other African countries. Therefore, wherever there's oil, China seeks to be there in order to diversify its resources and identify new territories to extract oil and use it. In addition to that, we can talk about minerals and material from mines. These are a part of the Chinese strategy because they are important when it comes to technology and making cars and electronics. The industrial infrastructure in China uses aluminum, uh, copper, cobalt, and other minerals, and these minerals are concentrated in few regions of the world, and China has no alternative. Although China is one of the main consumer of these minerals all over the world, but there is harsh competition between China and US and EU when it comes to extracting these material. When it comes to the agricultural sector, Africa is important to China, and concerning the food security of China. China wants to provide food security to the people, and we're talking about 1.5 billion people. This is why food security is a priority for China, and this strategy that relies on guaranteeing material from abroad will become stronger. China uses 1 to 2%, or used to use 1 to 2% of the resources of Africa in the past, but now the share of China is up to 20%. This is why this is a field of priority when it comes to China strategically and at the economic level, and it's projected to be on the rise. Thank you, Mr. Mustafa Jali. Thank you for respecting the time. I would like to move to Mr. Tajisir Abdullah Muhammad Omar, a military expert. Mr. Tajisir, we're talking about other powers trying to gain influence and competing in Russia and Africa. So, how do you see the Russian action?
In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, I would like to thank Al Jazeera Centre for Studies. I would like also to thank Al Jazeera Mubasher. I would like to thank you, Brother Mustafa. So, the Russian influence in Africa is not as it used to be after the Second World War, after the Cold War. There was influence by Russia in Africa because it was supporting the different liberation movements, and it had its own ideology that were support or that was supported by Africans, but it has lost its position after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now Russia is working in order to build a new hegemony in Africa. And this hegemony has no clear strategy. Russia works through the Chinese gateway. It coordinates implicitly with China when it comes to the Horn of Africa or Africa as a whole. It clearly coordinates in with the China in the Baltic area and other areas as well. Russia is not entering into any confrontations with the American influence in the region because the influence of the US is very strong, very steady with so many alliances, although these alliances have some contradictions in themselves. Sometimes we have a French American coalition or alliance, and sometimes an European and American alliance or coalition. All of them work within the NATO organization. So Russia tries to infiltrate into Africa through China, and Russia tries to build its own positions. It has its own military bases in Africa, but these bases are no similar to the American and French bases. So the continent of Africa has become overcrowded in terms of alliances and coalitions that happen to be on its soil. So that since 1884, since the Berlin Conference, that has given the green light to invade Africa. So since that date, we have seen an invasion of Africa by the former colonial powers such as Belgium, Germany, Turkey, France, and Britain. So they controlled so many areas, excluding Liberia and another country. So the Russian presence in Africa is strong, and there are so many countries that are concerned about such presence because they know that the presence of Russia is very destructive. They remember this experience, and we see the role played by Russia in the African continent. So there is an agreement that has been concluded between Russia and Ethiopia in order to train their forces, and this was due to the fact that Ethiopia needed such a help. There was a security unrest within Ethiopia. Ethiopia really needed such support from Russia, and we know that there is the crisis in Tigray, who have withdrawn from the state or the ruling power in the state, and now they are fighting the state itself. They have weapons and they have a lot of competence when it comes to this ethnicity. They have a long history in the leadership of the state. They have their own position within the state. So Ethiopia resorted to Russian help because the Ethiopian army relies heavily on Russian military support when it comes to tanks, air defense, or infantile forces. So during Gistu reign, the Ethiopian army used to get arms from Russia, and the Ethiopian army was formed by Russia. So that is why the Ethiopian army needs ammunition, particularly after these confrontations that can lead to the toppling of the regime itself, because the Oromo now they aspire to lead Ethiopia. They haven't done so before. The Tigray and Amhara ethnicities used to rule Ethiopia, and Oromo is a large ethnic group, and Muslims constitute no less than 35%. So Western powers fear such a rise, the rise of the Amuru ethnic group. So now Ethiopia tries to seek the support of Russia despite itself. So it doesn't want to do that, but it feels that it has to do that. So we know that Ethiopia is a Christian center, and America is not going to let go of Ethiopia. It will continue helping it. Would like to go to Mr. Mohammed Salmin Wold Omar from Mauritania, and we would like here to talk about the cultural dimension. We are still talking about France, and the cultural legacy, the francophone legacy that is still present in Africa. Any clarification for this particular dimension, Mr. Wold Omar? With regard to the Francophonian legacy, this is part and parcel of French strategy. But before answering your question, I would like to summarize this legacy, the French legacy. I would like to say that the most important manifestations of this colonial legacy is the level of political failure, the level of conflicts between countries in Africa, differences, social crises, conflicts and crises between ethnicities that have been splintered and distributed among the different African countries. Sometimes we find even crises amongst the same ethnic group. So these identities, these ethnicities are undermining peace and security in Africa. France also controls a lot of the economy of Africa through its companies. It also controls the currencies of African countries through their control of central banks. Many African countries are pegged to the euro, and they were pegged before that to the French franc. So when it comes to the Francophonian legacy, this is one of the weapons that are used by France. So French colonialism is a cultural colonialism. It's a colonial power that controls the minds and cultures of those countries. So many countries, their language is French. So in excess of 25 African countries speak French. 96% of Africans are French educated, and it is the language that is used in the different administrations. So this is the level of influence on African countries and also non-African countries. Some Africans dealt with the French language as something that they have looted from the war. So they got such a language in order to reflect and express their feelings, their emotions. But at the end of the day, these African countries that are French speaking, they are the most miserable countries that witnessed the collapse of their educational system. So African countries are backward in terms of education and industries and so on and so forth. So French as a language is losing its position, its spark, even within France itself, to the benefit of Anglo-Saxon, Anglo Anglo-Saxon culture. So there are these divisions that are happening, and we have this phenomenon that is increasing, and we have seen an increase in the number of persons that are adopting this legacy. We see their impact is increasing. Some countries have started paying heed to Arabization. Senegal, for instance, has started giving school certificates in Arabic, and there are specializations that are and disciplines that are taught in Arabic in order to uh, uh, give rise to this cultural rise. So this decline in the French language is being compensated by the political presence of France and interference of France in the educational systems of many, many African countries. So we have many, many representatives of French elites that support such Francophone culture. So this Francophone culture has not been presented as a neutral language. No, it is a laïque kind of culture, and we have seen so many confrontations with the cultures of those countries as a result of the spread of the French language. We'd like to move to another theme, which is America and the security situation in Africa. Dr. Nassim, Senegal and Tunisia have taken part in those maneuvers. So how important these maneuvers are in the light of the security threats on the Libyan Algerian borders. In 4 minutes, please. I think we should pose a very important question here at the onset. So, what has Africa learned from the Libyan war? What are the lessons learned from the Libyan war? We have seen all these partners, and also we have seen an absence of a patriotic will in the light of a very fragile region, in the light of the chaos that we see in Africa, and also the interferences of the GCC, of Russia, the US. So instead of having opportunities and partnerships, so the African continent had been divided into two parts. So we have seen Tunisia and Morocco having military exercises with the US, and other parts having relations with other countries. So Morocco, through its military exercises, it thinks that it places a balance in its strategic relationship with the other countries. So we have seen all these efforts that are exerted by human capital in order to liberate themselves from colonial influence. With regard to Morocco and Senegal, Senegal to a less extent. Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Belhoul. Sorry to interrupt you, Belhoul, because we do not want you to move perhaps away from the question that I posed. I asked you about Senegal and Tunisia and the borders between Algeria and Libya. No problem. With regard to Tunisia and Senegal, and the same when it applies to Morocco, because Morocco has reinforced its relations with Tunisia. Because we remember prior to that, both Tunisia and Algeria played a role when it comes to the Libyan dossier. And all of a sudden, we have seen Morocco entering into the discussions pertaining Libya. So we have seen that Morocco has entered into the 2021 Lion exercises because they want to prepare for a second military exercise or maneuver in order to impact the different borders, Algerian borders. So the Jaws was leading the intervention forces, and based on the military exercise Eagle Power 1, in which Morocco took place, and Israel was also embroiled in this kind of exercise. Dr. Belhoul, sorry, you've taken 5 minutes. We wanted you to talk about Tunisia, about Libya, and the threats, the possible threats that might arise on the borders between Algeria and Libya. But please stay with us. We're going to give you another opportunity to take the floor and talk about these points. And now I would like to move to Mr. Mustafa Jali, the Moroccan researcher in geopolitical affairs. I would like you to talk about China. So the question that is posed, if China is interested in raw materials, what would China give in return? Because it is benefiting from the raw materials and resources of Africa. What does China give in return? First of all, China presents itself as a developing country, the largest developing country in the world. It was able to achieve development for its people, and it undertook a an industrial revolution. We have seen visits carried out by Chinese officials, visits that give priority to the African continent. And there are a number of conferences that have been convened. So the pathway that has been undertaken can be summarized in infrastructure and aid in return of raw material, because the African continent caters for the needs of China in terms of raw materials and resources, and China in return gives preferential loans and exemptions from certain loans, and also direct foreign investments through the building of dams, railways, airports, in order to achieve economic development in Africa. Such strategy started in the year 2000 when the Chinese African Forum started, that has set strong bases for this relationship, particularly economically and commercially. If we look at the this partnership, we will find that the commercial relationship between China and Africa has reached in 2020 187 American billion dollars, and China remained one of the largest, or the largest commercial partner of Africa. It has reinforced its markets and investments, and these investments covered 47 African countries. So that is why African investments and this Chinese aid is made in order to gain the trust or confidence of Africans. So this is a win-win situation for both Africa and China. If we take into account the pandemic, China has given a number of resources such as medical teams, resources in order to help those African countries find a way out from this pandemic. And also we have had the new Silk Road that includes Africa, particularly East Africa, and it covers the economic and commercial aspects in particular. So China wants to give to Africa what has not been given to Africa by the West, concentrating on confidence based on a win-win scenario with no exploitation or hegemony, with no preconditions, because the West imposes preconditions on African countries such as democracy, respect of human rights, and sometimes interference in the internal matters and affairs of African countries. So China came with a different strategy, the strategy that Africans no longer want. Please stay with us, Mr. Mustafa Jali. I would like to move to Mr. Taj Sir. We would like to talk about another competitor, Russia. Mr. Taj Sir, the places of influence of Russia in Africa, and what does this mean? The Russian influence militarily is in Eritrea. There is a Russian military base in Eritrea, although Eritrea has no loyalties or allegiances to one country. It deals with the Americans, with the Europeans, with the Arabs, with Saudi Arabia, with the Emirates. It has no principles in terms of how to deal with countries. So that is why the Russian presence in Eritrea is full of risks. That is why the Russian presence is marginal and does not serve the Russian strategy. Despite the fact that there is no clear strategy when it comes to the Russian hegemony in Africa and in the Horn of Africa in particular, but Russia works, as I said, from the gateway or through China. So the Chinese Russian cooperation scares the West, it scares America. So they try to be present in Falamango, in Sudan. They try to go south. The Russians used to be in the south of Yemen. So during the two-state era when there was the Yemen al-Janubi or South Yemen, now the situation is not as it used to be. So Russia tries with China, tries to create an axis that would be parallel to the axis of the United States of America because they do not want to have a monopoly. So they want to have a new axis to strike a balance in Africa and worldwide in general. So such a move, such an exercise is carried out in cooperation with China. So Russia tries to infiltrate into the Red Sea in order to protect its presence in Syria. So if the US move towards or becomes or opens up on Sudan, there might be military cooperation and there might be bases in Sudan, and these are going to be adjacent to the bases built by Russia in Syria. And there might be some other regions that might be impacted, such as the Silk Road. So they want to control this road in order to secure and safeguard their southern borders. And the situation in Afghanistan is not clear. We might see the return of the American influence in Afghanistan and the region. We might see a return of the American forces into Afghanistan. So these forces might return once again, and this is not going to be in favor or in the interest of Russia. That is why Russia tries to support itself against the influence of the US. Because we know that America is part of NATO and has alliances with the 10 to 15 European countries that are all having a coalition in the region, coalitions with countries such as France and Britain and other countries. There is also an attempt by Turkey to be present in the region, and we know that Turkey has a historical presence in the continent through the Ottoman Empire. They might coordinate with Russia, but the coordination level is going to be limited because Turkey is a member of NATO.
So I'll go back to my guests with one last round of questions. Let us go back to France and the colonial heritage. And Mr. Muhammad Salem Wald Omar, you talked about the heritage of colonialism, and so the French culture in Africa. Could you please elaborate on this? When it comes to the French heritage and the presence of France in Africa, it is diminishing, but it is not weak. Uh, it still has resilience, and it is still capable of adapting and adjusting and resonating among the societies of Africa. So this corrosion that we can talk about is caused by the bad policies uh, in France towards Africa. The policies of France dealt with Africa as if it is a big mine for minerals, and the peoples of Africa cannot uh, manage their own uh, countries, and the French ask the question, why do they hate us? Why do the Africans hate France? As these feelings of hate towards the French is increasing. Also, there is the factor of competition and the different international parties that compete in the African continent, to include the United States role that is influencing Africa through security, culture, education, in addition to the increasing presence of Russia that is highly effective and targets the uh, core of France's role in Mali and in Central Africa, and also the Turkish presence that is gaining a bigger share in Western Africa and focusing on the security and economic dimensions. And in addition to that, we can talk about uh, lack of coordination and harmony in terms of Arab presence. There is a Qatari presence, Emirati presence, Saudi presence, and this also can be mentioned in light of the uh, powers in the Maghreb, and the Arab presence was influential. So, in the future, the the heritage of France, or the influence of France, is uh, not going to disappear quickly. It will still be part of the shaping of the culture of Africa, and it is important to elaborate a level of relationship between Africa and France that is equal footing, and this seems to be difficult for France because they are still dealing with Africa. And sorry, Mr. Muhammad Salam. Sorry, Mr. Muhammad Salam. Muald Omar, please stay with me. Dr. Nasim bin Hol, back to you, sir, regarding the United States and the security issue. What is the US strategy, military strategy, that is adopted during the Biden administration, and the impact on Africa and building a security matrix that is up to the needs of Africa? In 3 minutes. 10 seconds regarding the first question. Tunisia and Senegal are undoubtedly the partners of Algeria when it comes to the African Union's approach in strengthening peace and security in the continent. However, their normalization with the Zionist entity and the partaking in US exercises is like backstabbing Algeria. And here I would like to differentiate between Senegal and Tunisia as forces, minor forces, and some other countries are just tools that are uh, being used. When it comes to the U.S. United States approach, it is shifting from leading from behind to leading from the front. The United States, based on Biden's approach. In reality, it's not Biden's approach. It is a continuation of the US agenda in the African continent. It is strengthening the disintegration and reconciliation. And it is strengthening the armies of countries coming out of conflicts. In addition to that, it is establishing parallel parties at the level of security. But the US approach is being faced by some parties in Africa. And for instance, we can talk about the Senegal army and the Tunisian army and other armies that never participated in direct exercises. Uh, the Moroccan army in this context participated in the UN mission, but the uh, African Lion 2021 exercise is actually the exercise that would highlight the fact that the armies of Africa are weak, vulnerable, and highly dependent on the United States of America and Russia, and the you the voice of the speaker cannot be heard. Please stay with us, Dr. Nasim. Mr. Mustafa Jali, question to you regarding China. How can the African countries benefit positively from partnership with China, or are we witnessing some sort of new economic colonialism that takes the shape of cooperation? Yes, the two parties benefit, but China has the upper hand. Many researchers see negative impact by China on African countries. For instance, regarding raw material to China. This re-establishes the relation between Africa and the former colonial powers. In addition to that, when China is importing and exploiting the raw material coming from Africa, is negatively impacting the endeavors of African countries to develop local manufacturing and diversifying resources and the endeavors to provide employment to Africans. In addition to that, this impacts the economies of the African countries. Since the beginning of 2021, when China started importing the raw material at high prices, this had positive repercussions on the socioeconomic situation. However, when the minerals and the raw material became cheaper, these countries began witnessing political and social crises. And we also need to take into account that the Chinese always have the upper hand when it comes to the trade balance. In addition to that, people notice that China is present in African countries where raw materials are abundant, as opposed to their relative presence in other poorer uh, countries of Africa. Also, we can talk about the debt problem that surfaced recently. The Western countries are using this uh, approach in order to demonize the presence of China. And for instance, the United States talks about uh, the fact that China is confiscating the assets of African countries because of these debts. But on the other hand, China is trying to present itself as the power that wants to assist the African continent. Despite that, African experts still consider that China will continue to import more raw materials, so African countries need to seize this competition, this harsh competition, in order to develop the economies of Africa and develop uh, the country. One last question to Mr. Tajissar. You talked about the Russian experience in another continent. It was a failure and disappeared. So, talking about the future of the Russian influence in the African continent, how do you see it? In 3 minutes, please. The Russian influence in Africa could develop, as I have said. Previously, I talked about China being the first investor in Africa. There are major investments in Ethiopia relying on the economic aspect. As to Russia, Russia can invest in minerals and has companies, but all these companies have military intelligence background, and this raises concerns in African countries. The Russian history in the region is scary. The countries that want to benefit from its resources and develop its resources away from intelligence agencies and spying cannot seek refuge in Russia. Russia can assist through armament and providing these countries with weapons, and Ethiopia is trying to build greater relations with uh, Russia. And now there are more indicators. The Ethiopian ambassador in uh, Russia was foreign minister, and this shows that relations are to be built, but these relations are influenced by the U.S. presence in the region and the U.S. Uh, endeavors in the region. Also, the water uh, resources in the region are an important issue. The Renaissance Dam, the intentions of Israel to benefit from the Nile. These programs are all going to be used. Therefore, the Russian presence could be short lived because some parties are driving it far away from the region. The United States wants to reduce the Chinese impact in the region and wants to control the oil resources in Africa. So Russia relies on coordinating with China in terms of its presence in Africa, but this presence is threatened. Also, the African countries take into account the history, Ethiopia in particular, and the Russian presence in Ethiopia was problematic. So, Ethiopia suffered and witnessed atrocities. So, this present cooperation with Ethiopia could be short lived. So, the Russian presence or influence does not have a paved way for it to reach its objective. Please stay with us, gentlemen. We reach the last phase of this conference, the social media, the contribution from Twitter and Facebook. We had posed a number of questions. Why is are the superpowers competing more in Africa? Is it to exploit the resources of the continent? Muhammad, for instance, said on Twitter uh, that should Africa invest its resources, Africa would become the greatest continent in the world. This is why all the superpowers try to destroy developing countries in Africa. Ammar says the superpowers eat from the Africa or have been eating from the African continent since decades, but now it has been highlighted because of the expansion of the Islamic State in Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Mozambique, Somalia, and Mali, which threatens the interest of these countries, particularly the countries that were looted from Muslims for dozens of years, for decades. XYZ, they are competing to steal the resources. Salim says they criticize you when you talk about their liberties and fake democracies. But Africa is the richest country and the poorest of peoples. Muhammad Rushdie said everybody wants to have investments in Africa in order to exploit the resources and wealth. Um, so these are some of the comments of our followers on Facebook and uh, Twitter. So, 1 minute for each guest to comment regarding the social media.
Thank you very much. This international competition, this is one phase that extends from the old colonial era. So the colonial powers have shared the hegemony over Africa, and now they have their own competition over interests because they want to exploit this very, very rich continent. So the resources are being discovered day after day. So they do that in the name or under the pretext of fighting terrorism and armed groups and so on and so forth. Many have been moved from the Middle East, from Asia to Africa. And in Africa, there is a large scope for these groups to expand and to take advantage of this continent to have yet another phase of colonialism. So this continent is suffering catastrophes of terrorism, and this is something that is very sad. And exiting from such a situation requires that Africa should be liberated by itself, should liberate itself by its people. Please stay with us, Mr. Muhammad Salim Bil Omar. I would like to go to Mr. Bilhul. One last comment about the comments of the viewers. The African continent is a geographical treasure. Exploiting this wealth can only be through the support and prop up of a strategy. We would like these efforts to prop up the African continent should be linked to efforts by the people and the regimes. We can benefit from the expertise of the people, from partnerships in order to move into a transitional phase. But in order to interact with these great powers, you have to be always ready to deal with any interventions. We would like to move now to Rabat. Your comment, Mr. Mustafa Jali, about the social media comments. Yes, the African continent is a rich continent with poor people. So that is why we see a new beginning of this competition, because the competing powers, Western and non-Western powers, they try to present themselves through a new face, development, democracy, human rights, and these crises are still running in Africa. That is why Africans should rely on themselves, should go beyond trusteeship that is imposed on themselves by the West and the great powers, Japan, Brazil, Israel, Turkey, and so on and so forth. So this move, we have seen it materialize through the free trade agreement. So that is why effort should be exerted in order for Africans to be able to rely on themselves, for them to overcome and go beyond the difficulties that they have faced. Would like to give the floor to Mr. Tajissir to comment about the interventions of the different members of the audience through social media. This colonial view, this effort is going to continue with the same strategy, the strategy that is followed in the region. So these entities, they want to exploit the resources of Africa. They want to make of Africa a large market. So that is why these competitors, they do not want Africa to have a great economy, to use its own resources to reinforce its economy. If there is no political will in Africa, and if there is no good partnership, excellent partnership in Africa to use the resources of Africa to serve the people of Africa, then there's not going to be any solution to this colonial European aggression. So that is why we have to have patriotism, we have to have a will. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we have come to the end of the second session of this conference convened by Al Jazeera Centre for Studies in cooperation with Al Jazeera Mubasher to talk about the topic of tonight, which is the theme of this conference, International Competition in Africa, Motives, Parties and Dimensions. We would like to thank Mr. Mohammed Salim from Nouakchott. We would like to thank Mr. Basim Belhoul from Algeria. We would like also to thank Mr. Mustafa Jali from Rabat and Mr. Taji Assir from Doha. Would like to thank him very much. Thank you so much, distinguished guests, and would like to thank you for your time. Thank you. We have come to the end of the first day of this conference, and we'll meet you once again tomorrow for the third and fourth sessions. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all.